My name is Lori Rosenkopf. I'm a professor at the Wharton School, and I'm Vice Dean of our undergraduate program. And I'm so thankful to be here with you today. What a fantastic event. Our next panel is on methods, and I have three really incredible speakers up here with me. Noah Zandan, who's the CEO and co-founder of Quantified Communications. Kate Glazebrook, who's the principal advisor at the Behavioural Insights team. And Duncan Watts, who's the principal researcher at Microsoft Research. We are going to have a little bit of a different format. We're going to have each speaker come to the podium for 7 minutes and immediately follow each speaker with 3 questions, because we're really digging into the tools that they have, so we want you to be able to ask those questions immediately. So it'll be 3 presentations next to each other, followed by Q&A. And we're going to start with Noah's presentation, which is more focused on identifying certain things about individuals, and move to Kate's and then ultimately to Duncan's, which is more about looking at interactions among a broader network of individuals. So without further ado, Noah.
So if you think about what makes a great employee a great leader, passion, drive, imagination, experience, maybe luck, right? All those are important, but research shows that there's another factor. It's communication. It's how we talk to each other. We spend 80% of our waking time and our working time communicating in some form or fashion. But we're here at an analytics conference, and we've always considered communication to kind of be more of an art than a science. What I want to talk about today is how you can start to measure communication. So I'm a data scientist. I run a company in Austin called Quantified Communications, and what we do is we apply analytics to how people talk, how they communicate. And we do this to help people better impact their audiences. I've been doing it for years. It's actually not how I started my career. I began my career as an analyst, like many Wharton MBAs on Wall Street. What I noticed there over time was there was a pattern in the decision-making that we didn't have data for. All these big deals, all this risk analysis that we were supposed to do, it kind of all came down to a missing critical factor in our models, which was how the executive teams communicated, whether they were able to stand up at the investor presentation and convince people that they were going to execute effectively on the plan. And I'm a numbers guy, and I'm saying to myself, well, there's no data behind this. There's no science. There's no analysis. I didn't understand why. So I spent the past 5 years trying to figure out why and how to measure this stuff. And so this is a methods panel. How did I do that? Well, first, we spent the first 2 years building a massive global database of people's communications, all the text, audio, and video we could scrape together, everything from earnings calls to presidential addresses to TED Talks. And then what we did was we went and polled thousands of audiences about why they react to presentations in certain ways. Do you trust somebody? Do you believe them? Do you want to engage with them more? When you understand that, you can break it down from a factor model. And so what we know is that so much of what we communicate is actually delivered and received on a subconscious level. What's exciting is with new technology, things like natural language processing, phonetic analysis, facial and gesture mapping, we can actually start to understand these conscious signals and give people conscious knowledge of them. So if I use pronouns a certain way, will you trust me more? If I make eye contact with you, will you believe me more? If I use my arm this way, will you think I'm more confident about the future of my business? These subconscious things that we do actually change how an audience perceives you. And if you can give people conscious knowledge of them, you can make them drastically better communicators. So what I want to talk to you about today is how we can start applying this stuff. So this is a smart audience with a lot of ideas. What my analytics team and I did is we looked at visionary communicators, people like Elon Musk, Steve Jobs, FDR, Amelia Earhart, TED Talks on innovation, BCG thought leaders, and we looked at what makes it work for them. What do they do differently than the average person? And we ran this analysis at scale. We looked at hundreds of transcripts, linguistic factors, phrases, words, topics. And what we found is that these people that we consider to be visionaries, they do 3 things in common. But it's actually not what we expected to find. So first, we thought people would talk about the future. We thought these visionaries would paint this picture of this utopian future. But in reality, what they do is they talk about the present. It's the most distinguishing factor by over 2 times in our model. Visionaries use 15% more present tense and 14% less future tense than the average communicator. So a visionary wouldn't say something like, we will achieve these results. Instead, they say, we plan to achieve these results. And the difference actually makes you say how and makes you credible. So let's look at how a famous visionary does this. Elon Musk. I mean, visions are amazing. Hyperlooping from San Francisco to LA in 30 minutes. The guy wants to die on Mars, but not on impact. But he'll say things like, the question is, how do you accelerate the advent of electric transport? In order to do that for cars, you have to come up with a really energy-efficient car, so that means making it incredibly light. He's not talking about some George Jetson hovercraft. He really applies all of his ideas to now with steps. So take Elon Musk. Here's an interview he gave on the future of energy and transport. What I've done here is I've highlighted his present tense in yellow and his future tense in green. We've measured him over 40 times. When Elon Musk communicates, he uses 4 times as much present tense versus future tense versus the average communicator. He's always applying his ideas to now. Second thing we thought visionaries would do is they would communicate complexly. They would think complexly. In actuality, very clear. We can measure clarity by looking at how many words people use in a sentence, how many syllables people use in a word, how they structure it. Is there a clear cause and effect? A visionary CEO would never say something like, over the next 3 quarters, through cost-cutting synergies and improved efficiencies, we plan to achieve these results. They would say, we'll save 12.5% by doing these 3 things. Drastic difference. A great example here, Sheryl Sandberg. Recent commencement address, she said, believing in yourself was part of what got you to this special day. To continue to believe in yourselves, don't let anyone put limits on you. Don't put limits on yourself. Really clear, 85% more clear than the average communicator. Cheryl's actually one of the clearest communicators we've ever measured. And that's why people connect with her and believe in her. The third thing we found about visionaries is we thought they would really talk about themselves and their vision. In actuality, what they do is they put it in terms for you. So visionaries use 60% more second-person pronouns, like you and your, and they use 38% more perceptory language, how things look, touch, and feel. So they wouldn't say something like, the connected home of the future will have great benefits. Instead, they'll say, you'll wake up and you'll have a warm cup of coffee waiting. The temperature will be perfect as it hits your skin. You can really feel the sensory difference. Great example here, Richard Branson, Virgin Galactic, Virgin Group. When Richard talks about things like space, look at what he says. When the rocket stops, you will be in space. There will be complete silence. You will unbuckle and you will float around as you gently lift up and hit the roof. He brings you into the experience with him. So what do we learn from all this? Well, first, what's exciting is we can actually start to measure communication. Second, we've all got ideas, we've all got visions. If you really want to impact an audience with those from a linguistic perspective, bring them to the present, make it clear, and let your audience in on that experience with you. And if you can do that, people want to hear your vision, and we all want our visions to be heard. What's exciting is with people analytics and with communications analytics and data, we can learn how to do this. Thanks.
Should everyone speak like a visionary in organizations? Where do you draw the line between being visionary and needing to implement?
I think it completely depends on your purpose, right? And so everything that we measure, we're conscious of really 2 factors in our model. 1, what's your purpose? And 2, who is your audience? So if everybody talked like Steve Jobs, there would probably be nobody to execute the plans. But for leaders who want to be considered visionaries and who aspire to these people that really make a dent in the world, it's really cool to understand what, from a more objective perspective, these people can do to be successful.
And what about empathy? How important is being able to put yourself into the other person's shoes to communicate in this way?
Extremely important. And you can start to measure things like that through pronouns, through second-person pronouns, and putting my brain in the perspective of how's my audience going to perceive this. One of the favorite things that we like to say to people is audiences are selfish. And so you have to really think about what your audience wants to hear from you if you want to connect with them. Be empathetic towards what their background is and why they're listening, and really respect the fact that they're spending their time paying attention to you.
One more question. Any variance between men and women? The writer says the visionaries you listed are mostly men, although you had small numbers.
Sheryl Sandberg.
Yes, correct.
Yeah. In the way that they communicate from a more general perspective, Cindy Chung, who's in the audience, worked with a guy named Jamie Pennebaker at the University of Texas, who's one of our advisors. He's looked a lot at male versus female communications. Females tend to connect with messages in a different way than men. I'm making a gross generalization here, but when you look at the data at scale, they connect more with stories, a little bit more with emotion. They really think about things from more of a narrative perspective, where men tend to be a little bit more analytical. And so you can see a little bit of the spread and how you connect with those different types of audiences.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Noah.
Yeah.
Well, hi. I hope I've taken something from Noah's talk and can pivot very quickly to being a better communicator. Hi, I'm Kate Glazebrook. I work for the Behavioural Insights team in the UK. And for those of you who are familiar with our work, you might have assumed I'm about to talk to you about a study that looks a little like this, where we take a population of people, we split them between 2 or more groups, and we run an intervention and test what worked. And you'd be right, because the kind of main game of what we do in the Behavioural Insights team is running randomised control trials. And indeed, since we started as part of a small unit in the Prime Minister's office in 2010, we've run something in the order of 260 randomised control trials on pretty much every area of UK domestic policy. But I'm not here to talk to you about a randomised control trial, and I'm not here to talk to you about things we've done to other people, or at least to the UK population. I'm here to talk to you about a different type of experiment we ran on ourselves. So what was the problem we were here to solve? It was this one. So this is a very experienced audience that I don't need to tell knows a fair bit about this problem. This is a standard CV I pulled from Google of our good friend Andreas and what his CV might look like. And I've just pulled out a few of the things you might be picking up from the very first part of his CV. So you're learning a little bit about his gender and his ethnicity from the photo. You're also learning a little bit about how attractive you find him, which subconsciously or otherwise is picking up. From his bio, you're also getting information on where he lives. So you might be inferring something about his socioeconomic status. You've even got his specific age, and thanks to some bizarre things that happen in Europe, you've even got his marital status. It's not entirely clear why that's relevant, but nonetheless you have it. Now, those of you who are American might be saying, well, that's all fine and dandy for people over there in Europe, but we don't allow most of this information to go on our CVs. And that's true, but you do always have name, and you do always have things like when people graduated school. And I'm sure most of you can relate to the fact that when you see a CV, it's very hard not to do an inferred age from the time that they graduated high school or finished their first degree. And you've also got some explicit things, like where he went to university and how prestigious it was, and something about his attainment level. Now, we were worried, as many of you might have been, and Danny Kahneman spoke to this last night, about the problems that we might have with all of this salient information before you've gotten to any of the body of whether or not Andreas is going to be good for the role. And we were worried about that too. So this is what we started to do about it in the Behavioural Insights team. And very quickly, or rather 7 to 9 hours into a process that me and my colleague Theo went through last year when we were doing recruitment into the team, we discovered that this is quite painful. Rubbing names off CVs by hand and then photocopying them several times because we were keen to do the wisdom of the crowd and get independent assessments still seemed like a pretty hazy process to us. And we weren't alone. This is a collection of headlines just over the last year on people who are increasingly concerned with diversity in our workforce and the biases that might be affecting people's ability to get jobs. So what we decided to do about it was to create a new tool. Now, the Behavioural Insights team typically spends its time poring over the academic journals, writing literature reviews, providing policy advice, and as I said, running randomised control trials. And yes, we did do those things, and we have written a report which you can get online on what we think the behavioural science says about recruitment and selection. And we ran trials, including to increase the racial diversity of police officers in the UK. But we quickly discovered that organisations don't have the time to read through our literature reviews, and most of them just want a simple solution. So we've come up with Applied, and I'm really excited to talk to you about the very first results that we have on testing Applied versus the CV method. So what did we do? In the Behavioural Insights team, we were looking to hire a grad round, and we accepted 700 applications from graduates across the UK and Europe. And we made them do a multiple choice test. That whittled them down to 160 candidates that passed the bar. And what we chose to do was run parallel processes. We put them through a pretty rigorous CV sift using 3 people in the team, where they scored their CVs based on the things that we looked for. They were done independently, I should say. We also put them through Applied, which was the tool that we've discovered and put together, spent a year putting together the things that we think Danny Kahneman spoke to last night. How many people do you need to optimally assess a candidate to ensure that you don't risk chucking out your best candidate? How do you ensure that they view and experience information in a way that mitigates the risk that they'll be biased? How do you mitigate against the risk of halo effects by chunking information and allowing people to assess things horizontally rather than vertically? And importantly, exactly what are you testing them on? What is predictive, or as close as we can get to it, in the literature of what works for finding a good hire? So that was what we put them through. We put them through both of those processes. And the successful ones from both of those processes came through to a rigorous assessment center, to a final interview, and then ultimately a bunch of them got an offer. Importantly, what this allowed us to do was to create 3 different groups. So we had candidates that came through because their CV scores were phenomenally good. We had a separate set of candidates that came through because their applied scores were phenomenally good. And then we got a 3rd group who would have come through whichever method we had used. And these are our results. These are fresh off the analytical table. We just got them in 2 weeks ago, in your first group to see them. So this is a scatter plot that shows you on the x-axis what their score was on applied, and on the y-axis how they performed in the assessment center. Those of you with good eyesight might be able to see that it looks like there's a positive correlation there. And in fact, for us, we were quite surprised at quite how positive that correlation is and the statistical significance of that regression line. But the real question is, great, so applied scores are a good predictor of your ability to do well in an assessment center, but what about CVs? This is what we saw. Now, don't overinterpret. That line isn't statistically significant, and those of you who are analysts in the room would like me to tell you that basically that's just saying that it's as good as random. So the CV scores we had people gave us no information about who was going to be good when we brought them into the assessment center. And this is what we saw in the final interview. Further proof, again, statistically significant positive correlation between your applied score and your ability to perform well in that final interview. Again, 3 assessors in that interview independently assessing using the best methods of structured interviews, and no relationship between the CV score. Small samples, but no relationship nonetheless. Now, this is interesting, but really from an HR perspective, the question is, did we hire different people? So these were the final 12 people we gave an offer to as part of our graduate group. And I'd like you to just have a think about the information I just gave you and give yourself an estimate of the likelihood that we brought in different people. Turns out 60% of the people we ultimately hired would have been chucked out under a CV sift. And importantly, of our best 5 performers, 3 of them wouldn't have gotten through had we not used applied. Now, this is a methods panel, and this is one experiment done on ourselves, so it's important to note that we should be replicating this. But for us, this provides important and compelling research that suggests we can be doing a lot better just by applying some basic behavioural science to hiring. Thank you.
Kate, would you be able to provide us a little more info on what the assessment center test consisted of?
Absolutely. So the assessment center was a 3.5-hour process where we had 3 different tasks. The first was we gave them so they're in groups of 4 to 5. We gave them a task to do a miniature behavioural insights team project. So a lot of what we were testing them on was a day in the life of being a graduate in the team. So we gave them a problem. They had to do a presentation as if they were presenting to a senior decision maker. So that was sort of a collaboration and team building task. We then gave them a negotiation task that they had to work through together. How do they deal with loss? One person in that group was always going to lose the negotiation. How do they mitigate the risk of breakdown in team dynamics as a result of that? And the third part was a sort of speed interview. And what was interesting here was the first 2 tasks had 3 assessors sitting there separately evaluating skills using structured interview. But for the final task, we brought in 2 people who hadn't been there in the previous 2 to mitigate against the risk of halo effect. So we had 2 new people without being biased by their previous performance, and we had their scores on short answer questions. So
the preliminary evidence you're showing us suggests that you might be on your way to developing a tool that could bring new people into an assessment situation, not unlike what Byron was talking about this morning. How do you see this evolving as you start to refine it? Is it just for government use, or will it go further?
No, we certainly hope it will go a lot further than just government use. Government's doing a lot of good things, but actually what we've discovered in our research out there is that just most organizations don't have access to even the basic tools. They don't have any process really at all in how they hire. So being able to bring some people into a very sort of easy tool that they can use to assess candidates is hugely important. What I would say was a lot of the motivation for us was also on social mobility. The government in the UK is hugely interested in improving social mobility and access to the labour market. So we also assessed, did we get people by different diversity characteristics? Now, our sample size was too small to really see statistical significance, but it looks as though we were getting much more diverse candidates through the applied route, which was blinded, than we were through the CV route. We'd love to replicate with anyone who's interested.
Thanks very much, Kate. We appreciate it. Duncan.
Thanks, Laurie. So I want to talk about this project that we've started at Microsoft called the Organizational Spectroscope. And just as a bit of background, social scientists have been studying organizations for many decades, since at least the 1950s. And for most of that time, the kind of data that they've had available to them looks like this, where you have something like the formal org chart for the company that you're interested in. You have some sort of aggregate statistics about its performance. And then sometimes you even do surveys or interviews. But of course, for all of this time, social scientists have been aware that in reality, what they're looking at is really a network, that you have a large number of individuals and they're communicating with each other, they're interacting with each other, they're influencing each other. They're doing this both within their own firms and across organizational boundaries. And a lot of the theory that we have in the social sciences says to us that these networks should matter, that there's some sort of aggregation process of individual level behavior aggregating up to firm or organizational performance, and something about these informal social networks is relevant to that performance. And so the inability to observe these networks has really been a thorn in the side of organizational science for a very long time. And so what is exciting about recent years is that we are starting to come across or generate data from the digital signals that come from ordinary, everyday employee activity, people sending emails to each other, people scheduling meetings, people working through collaboration apps, or even interacting through documents. And through all of these activities, they're generating the kinds of signals that really start to look like the networks that we believe are important. So there's really unprecedented scale and also granularity in the data that we are starting to be able to get access to. But of course, as you're probably already thinking, this sort of data also raises really interesting and important and non-trivial issues around individual privacy and also sort of ethical implications of handling data. So in response to this opportunity, a group of us in the Computational Social Science group at MSR New York have started this project that we call the Organizational Spectroscope. And we've been doing it in collaboration with our colleagues in the HR department at Microsoft, several of whom are here in the audience today, and also in the Office group. And so the general goal of this project, and this is sort of really a meta goal over probably several years, is to combine these digital signals that we're getting from email and other sources with more traditional types of data to generate novel organizational insights. And I want to emphasize, and I'll illustrate with a couple of slides in the next few minutes, that the insights could be at different scales of the organization. So we're interested in insights that apply to individuals, but we're also very interested in insights that apply at the team level, at the firm level, and even across firms. And finally, I should just reiterate that each one of these levels has different types of privacy and ethical concerns depending on the particular questions that you're asking and the number of people who are involved. Okay, so just to give you a couple of quick examples, this is a little app that we just built recently in our team where we can take an individual will log in and give their permission for us to extract several hundred of their outgoing emails. And all we do is just look at the headers of these emails, the subject lines, and the people on the CC and BCC list. And then we run this method from unsupervised machine learning called the topic model, where we use these emails to group, to infer from your email activity natural work groups that you're collaborating with on various different projects. So this is actually my email from the last few weeks. And on the right-hand side, you can see the network of people that I've been collaborating with, and the size of the circles tells you how much I'm communicating with them. The colors tell you what I'm talking to them about. So over on the left-hand side, you can see the dominant topics that I'm, or projects that I'm working with these different individuals on. And down on the bottom right-hand side, you can see a timeline which shows you how much of my time has been allocated to different projects. So this is just a very simple kind of insight for an individual to be able to look at their communication activity over the last few weeks and say, who am I working with? What am I working on? We can now pan the camera back and look at an entire organization. And this is a much less detailed view, obviously, where on the left-hand side you can see the org chart for 220,000 employees of a large technology company. And on the right-hand side, you can see a subset of this graph. And this is now actually the communication network between 30,000 individuals who have exchanged at least 10 emails with each other over the past week. So there's very little detail here. We're just looking at, has person I sent at least 10 messages to person J, but already you can tell that there's a lot of non-trivial structure in this organization. So what can we do with that structure? Well, one thing that we can do is try to make predictions about teams within the company and how satisfied they are. So by combining this sort of data with more traditional employee survey data and aggregating that data up to teams that are at least 5 individuals, we can make predictions about the least satisfied members. So we're using here a different type of machine learning model, and we're focusing on the 15% of teams who respond most negatively to 3 particular questions on our annual survey. One is about satisfaction with a manager, another is about company-wide collaboration, and the third one is work-life balance. And with this model, we're able to obtain really extremely high accuracy. So if the model flags a particular team as being likely to have low satisfaction, it's correct between 80 or 90% of the time. And very importantly, if you take out the email features, if you're just looking at more sort of traditional data about job level and type, that precision drops to about 40 to 70%. So there are also, interestingly, very large differences between different types of job categories. For example, engineers have very different responses than salespeople. And then finally, we can also talk about collaborations across firms. So this is at the sort of largest scale that we're interested in, where we looked at 66 different publicly traded US firms over a really large, several orders of magnitude range of sizes in 6 different industry sectors in 21 different states in the US. And the preliminary findings here are that remarkably, the number of people that an individual will contact with their network size is actually basically constant with the size of the organization. And that's really quite surprising because the number of opportunities is going up with the size of the organization. So the fact that it's constant really says something about individual constraints. And finally, we can look at the temporal activities of these companies and extract what we call their organizational heartbeats. So I had a slide about the future, but after listening to Noah, I'm not going to talk about that and focus instead on the present. Thank you.
Duncan, in your experience, how much do these patterns of informal interaction between people mirror or diverge from the organizational chart and the sets of activities that the organization would have prescribed based on formal structure?
So that's a great question, and that's actually still something that we're figuring out. Some of these results are very recent, but I think you can, even just visually, you can see on that slide where I compared the org chart with the communication structure that there is really high correlation between obviously people communicate a lot more within their immediate work teams than they do to other parts of their division, and more so within their division than other parts of the company. But characterizing exactly how that decay curve trails off, I think will tell us a lot about different signatures for different types of organizations. So that's sort of an active area of research for us.
What about employees' own satisfaction with the job? How is that correlated with any of the network or interaction characteristics that you can monitor?
Well, the results that I showed you they are individual employees responding to these surveys. We're just aggregating those responses up to at least 5 employees just to obscure any possibility of identification. But I think the results actually, you can interpret the results as individual responses. So I think that I guess maybe the answer to your question is, like, what are the features that predict low satisfaction? So let's take work-life balance for an example. It turns out that the number of out-of-hours emails that you're sending is highly predictive of your work-life balance. So, which is not surprising, but I guess the surprising thing is that there were lots of other things that might have predicted it as well, and the model's able to pull out the 1 or 2 important things that actually matter.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Duncan. Thank you to all of our panelists for a really informative panel.